What's up, guys, and welcome to NFL Player Pool Week 2. There are a lot of assumptions being made in Week 2 based on Week 1 performances that we can take advantage of, and I'm going to get into it right after this. What's up, guys? Simon Edwards at PumaCom with Heat Seeker Sports, and you're watching Player Pool. This is Week 2 that we're analyzing for DraftKings main slate lineups. Going to get into the player pool for the main slate in this one. Before I do that, make sure to hit the like button. I'm looking for 50 likes to put out a shorter video or my favorite picks in the comment section as we get closer to lock. This is going to be a good week because in Week 1, there are usually a lot of assumptions made. In Week 2, there are a lot of assumptions made based off of Week 1 in DraftKings, and we start to get players at a discount who might not have performed well in Week 1, whether it's from being rusty or the matchups weren't as good as people anticipated, or just a number of things can go wrong in Week 1. And people give up on those players in Week 2, and we can take advantage of the ownership situation there. Make sure to also subscribe to the channel. I'm looking for, to get to 1,800 subscribers by the end of Sunday. So right now I need about 50 to get there. So I'm very close. I'm ultimately trying to get to 2,000 before Week 3, but we'll see how that goes. Showdowns have been crushing. Been doing well with the captain picks. We had Tucker Kraft as a captain pick on the show this past Monday or Thursday, actually. And then on Monday, I believe it was the Bills versus the Ravens. We had Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid in that show. So been hitting on the captain options. Haven't hit winning lineup on the show yet, but we did come close with that Green Bay game. I had the right idea, just couldn't get the right combination of players. But make sure to hit subscribe, and let's dig into this player pool. So we're looking at DraftKings pricing, just a PPR basically format. A lot of these guys, like if I see anyone that looks interesting on FanDuel, I'll speak up about that too. But primarily this is a DraftKings lineup show, but you guys can get an idea of the best plays based on matchup and alignment and stuff like that from this show too. So beneficial to anyone playing fantasy football. We'll get into the first game, Jacksonville at Cincy. This is a game where we're looking at let's see what the total is in this one. Looking at a 49.5 point total, 3.5 point in favor of Cincinnati. Cincinnati got off to a slow start last week. Their players didn't do too much, but they never do very well in the opening game of the season. Cincinnati has struggled coming out of the gate. Usually they're dealing with injuries, but they were all healthy this time around, and even with an emphasis of coming out of the gate hot, they still had a little bit of trouble getting their offense together. Came away with the win though, so that's real football. That's what they're mainly interested in. But we'll dig into this for a fantasy perspective. I'm going to go over to the injury tab. We'll check out and see if there are any significant injuries. We got some offensive line depth issues again. Standard for Cincinnati, pretty much. We got a few injuries on the defense. Other than that, no skill position players are hurt for Cincy, it looks like. Let's go over to their opponent. We're going to take a look at the Jacksonville Jaguars. With the Jaguars, we're looking at few injuries at the left guard position. We're looking at Ezra Cleveland as the main guy still healthy on that left guard. We're missing Wyatt Millam and Cooper Hodges there. Let's see. It's a little bit of depth issue there. We're looking at a couple injuries on the defense as well. A few guys are out. Um, so it could be interesting there from a matchup perspective, but with the depth issues. But I think for the most part, we can analyze this, pretty standard. Joe Burrow, obviously going to be a popular quarterback option this week, facing off against Jacksonville. Jacksonville's pretty weak in the defensive standpoint. Let's take a look at what they're giving up to quarterbacks. They're giving up 20.3 DraftKings points a game to quarterback. They're giving up 23.9 to wide receivers and 13.5 to tight end, according to 2024 stats. I haven't been going by the 2025 stats yet. Week one is kind of, teams still trying to figure out what's going on. And, so I'm not overly emphasizing the 2025 stats until we get to week 3 or 4. And then I think we can kind of, swap over to 2025 stats, but 2024, that's what, where Jacksonville was vulnerable, which is a good thing, obviously, for Joe Burrow and the passing game of Cincinnati. So Joe Burrow, if we're looking at the ownership situation, let's get an idea of what his ownership is. Joe Burrow is going to be under 10%, which is good. Still, pushing 10%. So we don't like to see double digits with these quarterbacks necessarily, but Burrow has a pretty good matchup here. He's expensive at 6,600. We also got Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, he had a week last week where, they just weren't, competing that hard in that game because, Carolina just basically folded right off the bat. They won 26-10. I recommended Trevor Lawrence on the show last week, thinking that Carolina would be a little bit more competitive, but they continue to just be like a drag watching Carolina. So Trevor Lawrence really didn't put up any fantasy points. Unfortunately, he only put up 11. Should obviously be pushed more in this game. Let's see if people are giving up on him, get an idea of what Trevor Lawrence's ownership is. People have a lot of bad vibes towards Trevor Lawrence because he has not been a viable fantasy quarterback in a while. He's only at about 7% owned. So that's going to make Trevor Lawrence interesting this week against a weak Cincinnati defense. That Cincinnati defense was giving up 19.5 DraftKings points a game and 21.3 to wideouts, 19.5 to quarterback, and they were giving up 17.6 to slots. They were also giving up, 16.6 to the tight end. So tight end for Jacksonville, Brenton Strange is going to be in a good situation this week. We'll take a look at Brenton Strange. Last week he had, like a decent amount of targets. He had 4 targets, 4 receptions, ended up getting 9.9 DraftKings points. And that was, like I said, against a team that they didn't need to pass on a whole bunch. So that's pretty good for Brenton Strange as a tight end. And if we're looking at the slot, I think Travis Hunter was running the majority of his routes from the slot. So that'll be interesting for Travis Hunter. He had 9.3 DraftKings points. He had 8 targets last week. So let's take a look and see what Travis Hunter's ownership is looking like. All right, looking at he's under 10% too. So people haven't, gotten into Travis Hunter just yet. But I do think that Travis Hunter is a guy that we can keep in our player pool based on this matchup. I think a lot of people will be on Brian Thomas Jr. Brian Thomas Jr. did not have a great week last week. 9 DraftKings points, but we expect more out of him. Did have 7 targets, 1 reception for 11 yards, and I believe he had a rushing touchdown too. So not touchdown basically saved him. Otherwise, he scored like 3 DraftKings points. We don't want to see that out of first round pick. At least in our fantasy drafts, we were drafting him in the first round for best ball. So Hopefully we see something else out of Thomas Jr. this week, but the matchup is improved. Well, matchup is still a good matchup against Cincinnati, but it'll improve with the game environment this week. T. Higgins is another guy, we can probably look at this week. He had 4 targets last week for 6.3 DraftKings points. Obviously, Jamar Chase, he only had 4.6 DraftKings points. If you watch the, I can't remember if my BetMGM video, I had him going under the total, under his total yards, just based off of the matchup against Cleveland and, thinking it was going to be a lower scoring game. I pretty much faded the Bengals last week. I didn't have a whole lot of Bengals exposure, but this week is a different story. I think the Bengals are going to be one of the teams that we want to focus on. And let's see, tight ends. It's kind of a timeshare here now that they brought in Fant this offseason. So we got Gesicki, we got Fant, and I believe Drew Sample was getting like usage last week too. So it's just kind of a mess for Gesicki. Not interested in him. And on top of that, Gesicki's primarily was having big weeks when T. Higgins was out. So we don't see that this week. So let's move on to Buffalo versus the Jets. This should be a good game too. The Jets usually play well against Buffalo, and they usually play pretty well against Josh Allen too. Let's get an idea of how the Jets have done versus Josh Allen. All right, so the last time Josh Allen faced off against the new head coach of the Jets, he ended up scoring 41 fantasy points, so that's important. Let's see, Josh Allen versus let's get an idea of Josh Allen versus the Jets for his game logs. I'm going to share Pro Football Reference here. This is something that I like to use when when I'm looking at the history of a player versus a team. We can sort here by opponent. Kind of scroll down here to the Jets. 182 passing yards last season with 2 touchdowns, 215 with 2 touchdowns, 275, 3 touchdowns, 236 with a touchdown. As far as rushing, let's see, I believe that's the rushing yards here. He has not rushed very well against the Jets. 5-17-1. He scored a touchdown in that one. 9-18-1. He's scored the touchdowns, but his rushing yards have been, pretty weak for the last couple years. As far as the scores, 40-14, 23-20, 32-6, 16-22, 20-12. But Buffalo's defense was pretty weak against a dual threat quarterback in Lamar Jackson last week. Obviously, Lamar Jackson's on a different level from a guy like Justin Fields, but Justin Fields played pretty well last week. They're looking at a new coaching staff in the Jets. It was an emotional game for the Jets last week, playing against Aaron Rodgers, who just left the team and didn't have very nice things to say about the Jets on the way out. And honestly, Aaron Rodgers played with a lot of emotion, and so did the Jets against Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron Rodgers ended up winning that matchup by 2 points. So it was a very close game, highly contested. Justin Fields comes off that big game to face Buffalo, another game where he should be playing from behind and needing to put up points. Goes up against Josh Allen, obviously, and Josh Allen coming off an emotional game too, facing off against that rematch against Baltimore. They played on, can't remember if it was Sunday night or Monday, but they played in one of the island games, so a little less rest for the Bills against the Jets this week. And Josh Allen, he's always going to be in play. But you've seen the box scores against the Jets. He's able to put up like 20 DraftKings points against them, probably between 20 and 30. He is expensive though at 7,200, so you got to take that into consideration if you're going to use Josh Allen. But he's definitely in play, as is Fields. I think the Jets are going to be much easier to stack. Breece Hall last week got a ton of run, 19 carries, 107 yards, did not score a touchdown, but he also had 4 targets for 38 yards. So, Breece Hall, was back to getting a pretty heavy usage. Let's take a look at the snap shares. I want to get an idea of how he compared to Braylon Allen. So I'm going to sign into an account here that I typically use. It's the Fantasy Pros Snap. I use the Fantasy Pros, like snap count leaders. So let's get into that. Let's see. Let's go over to running back. We're going to go to sort by team. Take a look at the Jets here. All right, so we're looking at 58% for Hall, 31% for Allen. So it's still a pretty decent split there. But Hall obviously had the big game against the Pittsburgh Steelers last week, and Hall, we got kind of a condensed offense with Wilson also being the primary receiver for the Jets. And as far as the matchup against Buffalo goes, we take a look and see what Buffalo is giving up to wide receivers. Buffalo's last season, they gave up 19.4 DraftKings points a game to the slot. Last year, we didn't see Garrett Wilson in the slot all that much, but this year we should see like him in the slot a lot more now that Devontae Adams is gone. 19.8 DraftKings points a game to wideouts is what Buffalo was giving up last year. But I do think that this is going to be a matchup that Garrett Wilson can exploit a little bit. Maybe we get an idea of Garrett Wilson versus Buffalo. We'll go back over to Pro Football Reference here, take a look at his career versus Buffalo. So Buffalo, 7 for 8, 66 yards and a touchdown, 170 yards and a touchdown, 9 yards, 34 yards and a touchdown, and 78 yards. So he's had some pretty big games against Buffalo. So I wouldn't rule him out. But Garrett Wilson is in play. Obviously, we're talking about Justin Fields as the quarterback now. So not quite the level of Aaron Rodgers, but Aaron Rodgers also played really bad last season. So Justin Fields can probably do something with Garrett Wilson like he did last week. 9 targets, 7 receptions, and 95 yards and a touchdown. It's a pretty good game out of Garrett Wilson last week, and his price is 6,500. So his price is pretty up there. Let's see, running backs. Cook, I'm not really interested in versus this Jets defense. Kincaid and Taylor, get an idea of them. 12 points is what the Bills were giving up to tight end, and 10.8 is what the Jets are giving up to tight end. So a little bit better matchup for Dalton Kincaid. So, you can consider him if you're doing stacks, but he really does not get the usage unless they're playing in a competitive game or playing from behind. You want the Jets to be playing from behind in this game so that we can keep Fields and Wilson in play. If we want to try and stack them. Let's go to Cleveland versus Baltimore. Now, the Cleveland-Baltimore matchups have been historically, pretty high scoring. If we go over to Lamar Jackson, we can see some of the scores that we've seen between these two teams. Like I was doing a little bit of digging into it, and there's been a ton of games between Cleveland and Baltimore that have just gone, like completely wild. So we'll take a look at some of these scores. We got 35-10, we got 24-29, 31-33. We got some of these outliers where it's 28-3, 23-20, 22-24, 47-42, 38-6, 31-15, 25-40, 26-40. A lot of these high scoring games between these two teams. And we're looking at probably a discount in ownership on Joe Flacco. If you've watched this show the past couple of years, you know that I like starting these veteran quarterbacks in these situations where, they have the potential to go off and just like way outperform their salary. And we're talking about a salary of $4,900 for Joe Flacco. Last week he did pretty decent. Kept it close with Cincinnati. Did not have quite the game I would have liked to see out of a quarterback facing off against a weak defense like Cincinnati. But Flacco is also a revenge game playing against his old team in Baltimore. You have to go way back for that. He won the Super Bowl with Baltimore, but Flacco 290 yards last week, 1 touchdown. We're not going to get any rushing yards out of him, but if we get a few touchdowns out of Joe Flacco against Baltimore at 5K, that'll be enough to justify having him as our quarterback. Lamar Jackson, kind of speaks for himself. Let's go back and see how Lamar Jackson has done against Cleveland in the past. We're looking at, let's see. That can't be, okay, that's yards. So if we're looking at Baltimore versus Cleveland, 217 yards and 2 touchdowns, 289 and 2, 186 and 2. Throws a lot of multiple touchdown games against Cleveland. 3 touchdowns there, 3 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns. We go to the rushing aspect, 6 for 63, 8 for 46. So he gets a decent amount of rushing yards too. Typically against Cleveland, 2 touchdowns in that one game back in 2023. Hasn't scored a ton of rushing touchdowns against Cleveland, but he's made up for it in the air. So, Lamar Jackson, if he's not getting that rushing production, then, I think it might be, better direction to go with maybe Joe Flacco if you wanted to stack this game and take the discount. Derrick Henry, we could run it back with Derrick Henry versus the Jets and hope that, Henry has a big week. I'm not really interested in any of those Cleveland running backs. Zay Flowers had the top game of wide receivers last week, which is something that we're not used to seeing, but they were also, pretty high scoring game. And it was pretty competitive. 41-40 was the result. He had 143 yards and a touchdown. So Zay Flowers definitely, having a outlier game last week. Flacco's primary targets, looking at Jerry Jeudy. Let's go over to, I found a good box score site that we can use. It's called The Huddle. And if you go to The Huddle, you can kind of get a good idea of what players you can set the scoring to DraftKings, so that way you're able to get the fantasy points in addition to the stat lines. So if we're looking at Joe Flacco, he threw 45 attempts last week, despite only being able to score like 17 points. But Sampson had 8 targets. We had Cedric Tillman with 8 targets. We had Jerry Jeudy with 8 targets. Fannin Jr. had 9 targets, and Njoku had 6. So relatively condensed, except for those tight ends. Those tight ends are going to be a crapshoot. But if we're looking at Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy, those will be the primary targets, I think. I like Cedric Tillman, I think, the most. He's just got the most upside. But Jerry Jeudy, he's got the potential to have a breakout game too. Obviously, with a competent quarterback, we saw a lot of good games out of Jeudy last year. Jeudy's at 5,300 this week, and Tillman is at 4,300. So Tillman is quite the discount for us if we want to get a cheap Flacco, Tillman, and maybe Fannin at 3,100, and then run it back with Henry. We could do something like that, or we could do Flacco with Tillman and Jeudy, and run it back with Henry. Like I kind of like both those potential options. The Browns versus running backs last year gave up only 19.2 DraftKings points. And the Cleveland running backs have a bad matchup as well. So that just makes me like the Cleveland passing game all the more. But I think Derrick Henry can pretty much overcome any matchup. If we wanted to look at someone from Baltimore we could play, is Cleveland was weak against tight end, giving up 13.7 DraftKings points. So that would put Mark Andrews in play, especially with no Isaiah Likely. So that's something that we can consider in our player pool. Mark Andrews last week, only one target off one reception off of one target last week. I don't like that a whole lot in a game that was a 41-40, 80-point game. So that's that's kind of rough for Andrews last week. It was primarily Zay Flowers that was getting all the targets last week. All right, let's move on to Giants versus Cowboys. This is a game where we have, let's see what the total is. We're looking at, by the way, the total on that last game was 45.5, with Baltimore's massive favorites, 11.5. So all the more for Derrick Henry there. Looking at the Giants versus Dallas and looking at a 44.5 point total with Dallas's 5.5 point favorites. So Dallas keep it pretty close with Philly last week, but they also took Jalen Carter out before the game even started with ejection for spitting at Dak. This is a good matchup for Dak. The Giants have a pretty powerful defensive front, but we didn't really see much out of them last week. Maybe we'll continue to see them be weak, but Dallas is playing at home. They get a chance to get an easy win versus the Giants. Russell Wilson, just completely stunk last week. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Jackson Dart come into this game if it's looking embarrassing enough for the Giants. But Prescott, decent game. Actually, not from a fantasy point perspective, but they kept it close with the Eagles. He had 188 yards passing. Did not throw any touchdowns. But again, the Eagles defense is really good. But even without Jalen Carter, they were able to slow down Dak. As far as fantasy points a game, Giants only gave up 17.3. Dallas last year gave up 21.5. But it depends on how much you want to take that risk with Russell Wilson. The Cowboys also gave up 25.1 DraftKings points a game to wide receivers. The actual wideouts got 23.5, and slots had 16.5 against them. As far as the better matchup for Dallas, it's going to be the wideouts, because the secondary of New York is pretty bad, and that's going to be George Pickens. We also see the CeeDee Lamb, run some wideout routes, but like George Pickens is going to be the primary guy. He's at 5,800. CeeDee Lamb had a big week last week. He's at 7,800. He ended up scoring 21 points against the Eagles. So both these receivers are going to be in play. Malik Neighbors is going to be in play from a volume perspective. 12 targets, 5 receptions for 71 yards last week. Russ Wilson is probably not the best quarterback for a guy like Malik Neighbors. So we'll see how that pans out. But they gave up 16.5 DraftKings points a game to the slot. If I'm getting an idea of what Malik Neighbors did from the slot, he ran 14 of his snaps. 14 of his snaps were from the slot. So that's a decent amount. It's probably a middling amount, but it shows that he was kind of being moved around a little bit. So Malik Neighbors, good volume guy for us. Let's see, what would be the best run back, though? If I was looking for a run back, I guess it'd be Malik Neighbors is probably the best option for us. And we're basically hoping that if we're going to stack that game, that maybe Russ Wilson gets benched, and we're looking at a situation where we have a little bit more upside at the quarterback position. I mean, the best case scenario would be Jameis Winston coming in and subbing in for Russell Wilson, but apparently Jackson Dart is ahead of Winston in the depth chart. But even with him being ahead of Winston in the depth chart, I don't know if they would run the rookie out this quick if they have Jameis Winston like on the bench. But let's take a look at these points. Looking at let's see, the targets, we had Tracy with 5, Neighbors with 12, Wan'Dale Robinson had 8. And that was really it for this offense. It was pretty condensed last week. So at least we have that going for it. It shouldn't be too hard to narrow down. So if we're looking at like the primary slot would be Wan'Dale Robinson. And really there's not that much of an advantage going with the slot receiver over the wide out if we're looking at one of these giants to pick from. So Neighbors and Wan'Dale would be in play if you want to stack that game. As far as running backs, nothing great on the New York side. Javonte Williams had a good game against Philly, but like I said, they got rid of Jalen Carter early. I don't think that they're going to be so lucky against this Giants defensive line. Unless we get some depth issues. Let's take a look. We'll go over to our injury report here. Wan'Dale is questionable. Andrew Thomas is doubtful. That's not good. And they already got one of the backups on IR. Depth issues at receiver, but it's nothing too big. Looking at the defensive end, Rakeem Nunez-Roches looks like he's doubtful. But look at this line for for the Giants. We got Dexter Lawrence. We got Brian Burns. We got Thibodeau. Like it's just a really, really difficult front. And I don't know like that we're going to see much out of Williams in this one. We do have a lot of depth issues in the defense, primarily to the secondary. So that's where we're going to want to target them. And I think that's what the Cowboys are going to be thinking. I think they're going to be thinking of targeting them deep. I like Pickens this week. I don't think anybody's going to be on him, but like I do like Pickens this week. Let me get an idea and see what his ownership is. Looking at like under 5% for Pickens. So Pickens could be sneaky for us, and Pickens is going to be at 5,800. Other than that, let's see what tight ends are doing. Tight ends not in play this week for either of these teams. Let's go to Chicago versus Detroit. Chicago versus Detroit. We're looking at a division rivalry, obviously. We got Chicago's defense. They looked good for some of that game and against the Vikings, and then they just completely collapsed. And the Vikings just first-time starter came out of nowhere, J.J. McCarthy, and in the second half just dominated this defense and ended up pulling out the win. Jared Goff did not look good in his first game this season against Green Bay, but we just saw Green Bay like destroy Washington, and they've got a formidable defense. I wouldn't read too much into that, but at the same time, we're talking about a Lions offense with a new offensive coordinator. They lost Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson, obviously with Chicago now, faces off against his old team. With a new defensive coordinator too. So the defensive coordinator is now the head coach of the Jets. So the guy that, Ben Johnson was used to facing off against in practice is no longer there. Caleb Williams, just continues to blow these games. He ended up having a decent fantasy line, 24.2 DraftKings points. He missed DJ Moore on a would-be touchdown, which could have changed the outcome of this game, honestly. But he's just 21 for 35, 60% completion percentage, 210 passing yards. This is all against Minnesota. Minnesota's defense, they blitz a lot, so that might have had threw him off a little bit. But we'll see how Caleb Williams does against Detroit. Detroit's got some weapons on their defense, so we'll see how he does against them. Looking at the total on this game, it's a 47.5 point total with the Lions as 5.5 point favorites in this one. Lions last year were weak against slot receivers, and they were weak, giving up 18.3 DraftKings points a game to the quarterback position. Chicago was pretty good against quarterbacks last year, only giving up 13.8 DraftKings points a game. They were weak against running backs, though, giving up 25.2. So, that's going to put our running backs in play in this one, and our slot receivers. Let me get an idea on the Chicago side who is running the routes out of the slot. Let's see, Odunze ran 11 snaps out of the slot versus Moore. Let's get an idea of Moore. DJ Moore ran 13 out of the slot. So it looks like who is the guy that joined them recently? Zacchaeus must have been running a ton of routes out of the slot. So Zacchaeus might have the matchup He showed a good connection with Williams too last week. 7 targets, 4 receptions, 42 yards. Zacchaeus, how much are we paying for him this week? Zacchaeus at 3,600, could be a cheap option for us to keep in our player pool. Based on Detroit was a target for slot receivers all last year. So, like Zacchaeus is going to be in play against this Detroit defense. Other than that, I do like the upside for Odunze this week, but I think, yeah, Odunze and DJ Moore are definitely going to have upside. If we wanted to stack this game, I'd probably stack the Chicago side and go with a run back of, like Gibbs or Montgomery. Probably Gibbs, obviously. But, like Montgomery's pretty cheap at 5,400 too. Swift, I'm not too interested in. The Detroit defense has traditionally been good against running backs these past couple years, so I would probably avoid Swift and stick with this run game for Detroit in this one. For the tight ends, we saw Laporta have a decent game last week, and he has a middling matchup against Chicago. Nothing to write home about though. But we could see a decent game out of Laporta this week too. Let's get an idea of what they were giving up. What Chicago was giving up to tight ends last week. I had Hawkinson as my captain because I really like the matchup now that I'm remembering. So maybe Laporta is in play this week. Hawkinson didn't end up doing anything. Hawkinson ended up, I got every one of my picks that I put in my comment section for that showdown ended up hitting except for Hawkinson, who I had in the captain. So that sucked last week, but every other play ended up hitting. It was Aaron Jones was one of the plays. And obviously, I just talked up the running backs for the Lions. So yeah, maybe Laporta and the running backs for the Lions are in play for this one. So keep Laporta in your player pool at 4,800. The other side, Detroit's pretty good against these tight ends. Let's take a look at the depth issues. We coming off of a season where there was a lot of depth issues for Detroit. Let's see how they're looking coming into the season. All right, so we got Taylor Decker. Their left tackle is questionable. So some damage on their offensive line. I thought I saw Penei Sewell get hurt or something in that game, but he's not on the injury report. But his backup is on IR. We got a bunch of these guys on IR, so we got a lot of depth issues. Kenny Laboa is the tight end. He's on IR. Let's take a look at the defense. Ezekiel Turner is on IR. Dan Jackson, Rakestraw on IR. A bunch of this defensive line and the linebackers are out. So a lot of depth issues there. But let's see. Anzalone is the guy that defends the tight end very well, and he's in. So I probably wouldn't really touch these Lions. I mean these Bears tight ends against the Lions. I like the Lions tight end against the Bears instead. So probably go more in that direction. Let's look at the Patriots first. The Dolphins. Now the Dolphins lost. Let me check and see who it was. All right, so Teron Armstead last year, whenever Teron Armstead was out, the Dolphins did considerably worse. They were very it was very, significant whenever he was out, like, Tua just could not perform without him in the lineup, and so he was a fade every time Armstead was out, and he retired in the offseason, and I said it in the beginning of last week's game that Miami was gonna be probably not able to cope with that, on top of all the, just the stupid issues that they're having, like infighting and stuff like that. So, I think that, we're gonna see a meltdown season for these Dolphins. I don't think that they're gonna be able to adjust. I think that they're just gonna look like a disaster this year, and they're facing off against New England. It's looking like we got rain, in that forecast, but New England last week was not that great. They lost to Vegas, 2013. Their defense didn't look good. Their offense wasn't that great, but they should be getting pieces of their defense back this week. Let's take a look at the Patriots. I think Gonzalez was out last week in the secondary, but he should be back. Christian, no, he's out. Gonzalez is out again. Um, get some issues with depth on the D line. That right cornerback is gonna be pretty weak. So if we're looking at maybe who primarily will go up against that, Tyreek Hill would be that matchup, but Tyreek is, he's dealing with domestic violence issues uh, on top of like all the other headaches that he was creating in the offseason, and coming off that wrist injury on top of it. And last week he really didn't do anything. Um, let's take a look at what we're looking at for injuries on the Dolphins. Darren Waller remains out. Austin Jackson on the right tackle, another offensive line injury. We got depth issues on the offensive line already. Bunch of injuries on this offensive line. I think New England's going to be able to take advantage of them. Ollie Gordon's basically got that backup role to himself right now with Devon Achane. I think that Ollie Gordon is going to have a decent season. Looking at the defense of the Dolphins, we got Storm Duck out. Their right cornerback position is super weak too. We're looking at the third string corner potentially, unless they're moving like one of their left cornerbacks there. Cam Smith is out. We're dealing with all sorts of issues. The nickelback position with Artie Burns, Mater, and Kohu are all out, so they're on down to one nickelback, and that's going to be probably good for Douglas. Let's go back over it here. We're looking at Douglas as a potential matchup advantage. Let me see where the alignment is for Booty. Lines up equally on the left and the right side, so he can take advantage of that mismatch too. Demario Douglas and Diggs, like we got like a few different weapons we could target here if we wanted to target some of these Patriots. Like I said, like these Dolphins, I just don't think that I think they're going to just collapse. So I don't have a lot of belief that they're going to you'll be able to put up points. Um, but Christian Gonzalez is out. So maybe if we start some of these Patriots, like if we wanted to put in May, maybe stack him with Booty and Douglas or something like that, or maybe we get Hunter Henry in there, and then run it back with Jalen Waddle. That could be interesting. The Dolphins gave up 13.1 DraftKings points a game to the tight end position, so that's pretty good for him. But I like that. I like that matchup for the Patriots against the Dolphins with all those injuries. So let's keep that in mind when we're building our lineups. They're all cheap too, so we got that going for us as well. All right, so if we're looking at Pittsburgh and Seattle, oh, you know what? I forgot to touch on the running backs here. So, like I said, like A-Chain, not really high on either of the running backs for the Dolphins with all their injuries to the offensive line. Henderson had 11 DraftKings points last week. He only had 5 rushing attempts. Let's get an idea of the snap count here. I'm going to get an idea of who was getting the snaps for the Patriots. I'm going to share over this screen instead. The snap counts, we're looking at 35% for Travion Henderson and 65% for Ramondre. Gibbs was also used, but still a heavy split towards Ramondre. So not really interested in the run games of either of these teams, honestly. But we can take a look at the game log too from last week and see what we saw out of New England's backfield against the Raiders. We saw Henderson. He was in there for 11 plays. He had 6 targets and 5 rush attempts. So he was used pretty decently in that passing game, whereas it looked like Stevenson was primarily the rushing back, doing the mainly the running. So, like 10 plays versus 11 plays. They were playing from behind against the Raiders, so that explains why Henderson was getting all that work in the passing game. But if they're primarily using Ramondre and then using Henderson in passing situations, then I just don't think that it's going to be the same situation this week with playing from behind. So looking at Pittsburgh versus Seattle, Aaron Rodgers is 2 touchdowns away from passing Brett Favre on the all-time passing touchdown list. So let's take a look at what the Seahawks did last week. They lost 13-17. Seahawks defense is really good. So I don't know if Rodgers will necessarily get it, but they're playing in Pittsburgh. So, I wouldn't be surprised if they make an effort to, to get that for Rodgers in his first home game. I think it's their first home game. I assume they played. Let's take a look. Yeah, they played at the Jets last week. So Rodgers would be playing his first home game for Pittsburgh. He needs 2 touchdowns to cross Brett Favre on the all-time list. So, don't be surprised if they make an effort to do that. But, they were playing a lot of play action with Rodgers. Rodgers has typically been resistant towards that. So that was interesting. And then he ended up having this monster game. If he'd have just relented and used, went to play action, maybe last year or, like his last season with Green Bay, maybe we would have seen some better seasons out of him these past couple years. But we saw like 244 yards, 4 touchdowns thrown. I believe 3 of those touchdowns came out of play action. So yeah, a lot of good with actually putting Rodgers in that Arthur Smith offense. So we'll see, like what he's able to do this week against a tougher defense. Although the Jets do have a tough, defense on paper. So, and their head coach is specializes in defense. So you would think that the Jets would have put up a better performance against the lowly Pittsburgh offense, but they did not. If we're stacking Rodgers, I'm looking primarily at Calvin Austin, I think. He had 17 DraftKings points last week. He's only at 4,700. DK Metcalf in a revenge game against Seattle could be interesting. He had 7 targets last week. On the other side, Jackson Smith and Jigba is interesting. Let's see. The weak spot of the Seahawks last year was the wideout position, but they were dealing with a lot of injuries last year. They also gave up. That was the weak spot of Pittsburgh. The weak spot of the Seahawks, they were getting targeted 34% in the slot. Pittsburgh was getting targeted 31% in the slot. So that's where Jackson Smith and Jigba obviously is going to be running most of his routes, but Njigba was running a lot outside too. So, Pittsburgh giving up 25.9 DraftKings points a game to wideouts is also, beneficial to Jackson Smith and Jigba. Let's see if I got any notes on Smith and Jigba for this week. All right. So, this is according to Rich Rebar. Smith and Jigba led the league in target share with 59.1%. And he played on 71% of his snaps. Played 71% of his snaps outside of the slot. So, that is interesting for us. They may try to Pittsburgh may try to use Ramsey on Smith and Jigba. But Smith and Jigba was obviously the primary target for the Seahawks last week. And that makes me interested in him this week at 13 targets for 9 receptions and 124 yards. He did not score a touchdown. If the matchup's going to be any easier this week, then Smith and Jigba is definitely going to be an interesting target for us, especially if we need a run back, if we wanted to stack up that Pittsburgh side. Other than that, Torrey Horton did not do anything last week. He's at 3,100. And Kupp, was a non-factor last week too. Two receptions off 3 targets. So we'll see what happens there, but we'll take a look at him when we're getting into our builds. Like Jonnu Smith was the primary receiving tight end for Aaron Rodgers last week. So keep that in mind. Moving on to the Rams versus the Titans. This is a game where we are looking at by the way, 39.5 point total on that Pittsburgh Seattle game with 2.5 point favorites are going to be Pittsburgh. Rams versus Titans, we're looking at a 42.5 point total with the Rams as 5.5 point favorites. Rams defense was pretty good last week. We go over to quarterback. They did pretty good against Houston, holding them to 14 or holding them to 9 points. And, Houston just looked terrible against them. And Houston's got some weapons. Um, Titans are rolling with a rookie quarterback and not a whole lot of weapons. So, I would say that the Rams are going to handle them pretty easily in this one. Tennessee was vulnerable out wide, giving up 23, or sorry, the Rams were vulnerable out wide, giving up 23.8 DraftKings points a game last season. They also gave up 15.1 DraftKings points a game to the tight end position, so Chiga Konku might be in play. The Titans last year were vulnerable to running backs, giving up 24 DraftKings points a game to a running back position. If we're looking at Chiga Konku, he got 4 targets last week. He could be in play. I would imagine they're going to be playing from behind, but again, a rookie quarterback versus a tough defense. And Kyren Williams, 18 attempts, still the workhorse in this backfield. He ended up with a touchdown. Has a easy matchup, much easier matchup than Houston this week against Tennessee. So Kyren Williams is going to be in play this week. And let's see. I guess you could consider Calvin Ridley in this one based on last year's performance, but this is where the Rams were vulnerable, but like Nico Collins couldn't take advantage of them last week. So I'm guessing the Rams have improved their defense significantly, and I don't think that the Titans are going to be able to exploit them if the Texans weren't able to. But you never know. Like Adams, I was anticipating to run a lot of routes in the slot against Houston, where Houston's weak, and it turned out that he did not. He ended up running most of his routes out wide, and Puka was taking all those slot receptions, ended up having a monster game. I was high on Adams, ended up, needing to be high on Puka instead. Puka against the Titans, he's not going to be facing Stingley this week. So, Adams isn't going to be facing Stingley this week. So Adams is going to be in play versus these Titans. And, Puka is going to be in play too, but it's just, the only thing is like how many points is Tennessee going to be able to put up on the Rams? I think I'd lean more towards Kyren. Carolina versus Arizona. This one we are looking at a 44.5 point spread or 44.5 point total with the 6.5 point spread in favor of Arizona. Carolina just got stomped last week by the Jaguars. Last year, the Panthers were weak against tight end, giving up 14.8 DraftKings points. That's where we got Trey McBride. Let's take a look over here. 9 targets last week, 61 receiving yards. Let's take a look at Trey McBride's ownership this week. Looking at about 15.7% owned for Trey McBride, which I do not necessarily like for a tight end. I don't like to have a tight end with that type of ownership, and he's expensive on top of that. Where Marvin Harrison also has a good matchup, likely to be much less owned. But I think ultimately, this game we're looking at We're looking at under 10% for Harrison, but uh, Connor is going to be in play again this week. I liked him last week, but they're facing off against Carolina. If Carolina's as bad against Arizona as they were in that first week, Connor ended up with 14 DraftKings points. I think he ended up with a receiving touchdown as well. 4 targets for Connor too. So that was a pretty big week for Connor. I like Connor this week as well against Carolina. He's got a much easier matchup. These quarterbacks, I mean, you could start Murray, but I just don't think it's going to be necessarily a competitive game. I would probably just stick with the running back for Arizona and Connor. Like the uh, the Cardinals also last year gave up 24 DraftKings points a game to the running back position, so they are a target as well. Like you could use Hubbard. Like Hubbard gets used in the passing game. He had 5 targets last week, scored a touchdown. I think Hubbard's in play this week too. 6K for Hubbard this week. So keep that in mind. Moving on to Denver, Indy. Indy came out of nowhere with a massive week for Daniel Jones in his debut last week, but he's facing off against a much tougher defense this week. That's that Miami game where Miami just melted down. Daniel Jones scored 29 DraftKings points against Miami. I think that they're going to be in for a wake-up call against Denver. This is a game where we're looking at a 42.5 point total. We got Denver as 2.5 point favorites. Last week, the Colts were weak against the running back, giving up 23.8 DraftKings points. Also weak against tight end, giving up 14.9 DraftKings points. So, Evan Ingram, if he plays, he was on the injury report. Take a look over here. Fullback is on IR for the Broncos. Evan Ingram does not have a designation. Dre Greenlaw is out for the linebacker crew of the Broncos here. And a bunch of guys are on IR, so they got some depth issues. Let's take a look at the Colts while we're at it here. Javarius Ward is out. Jalen Jones on IR. A bunch of guys on IR. I think the passing attack is going to be vulnerable, or the passing defense of the Colts is going to be vulnerable this week. And we got Cortland Sutton coming to town in this one. So, Sutton is in play. I think Nix, if you want to start Nix after a week one, he's at 6,100. It's kind of expensive. But if you wanted Sutton's at 6,300. He's good for a one-off. The running back situation in Denver is kind of a mess. They were splitting it. Dobbins ended up having the big game. Jonathan Taylor had a pretty big game with usage, 18 for 71. Also had 3 targets. I think he was on the field for the majority of their offensive snaps. He's at 6,700. The guy that broke out last week was Tyler Warren for the Colts. He had 9 targets, 7 receptions, 76 yards. Got just a ton of usage, 14.9 DraftKings points. He was basically their number 2 target behind Pittman. Pittman had a big game last week too, scored 20 DraftKings points. I think based on the matchup, if I was looking at anyone on Indy, I'd be looking at probably Tyler Warren, just because Denver's defense is pretty good. But yeah, I think ultimately I'm just gonna probably pass on this game unless I wanted to start Ingram or Sutton. But this game, I just don't not interested in that game. Last game we got Philly versus Kansas City, rematch of the Super Bowl where the Eagles spanked the Chiefs in that Super Bowl, just absolutely crushed them. And we saw the Chiefs have a super lucky fluke box year last year, just winning these games left and right by one score and just getting these lucky outcomes left and right. They shouldn't have won their division, much less the conference, but the luck just was completely on their side. And then they faced a real team in the Super Bowl and just got absolutely destroyed by the Eagles. And now, the Eagles have lost both their coordinator, or not both their coordinators. They lost their offensive coordinator. We saw them not that great on offense last year. They looked pretty sluggish, adapting to their new offensive coordinator. Defensive coordinator still there, though, in Fangio. And we saw Fangio just absolutely owned Patrick Mahomes in that Super Bowl. But traditionally, Mahomes has not done let's see what he's done versus Fangio. Done a write-up for those guys in the past. When KC has faced teams, let's see, where's Fangio? I want to try and get an idea of what Mahomes always had trouble, putting up points versus Fangio. Although they, they would beat the Fangio teams, but Mahomes was kept in check by Fangio for the most part. And now, we're talking about a team that is down Xavier Worthy. They're down Rashee Rice. They're left with Hollywood Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster. And Tyquan Thornton had a pretty good week last week. But, facing off against this Eagles offense, the only thing the Eagles offense, like I said, the issue is their offensive coordinator. We saw this a couple years ago when they lost a good offensive coordinator, and then they could not, adjust with the homegrown one. And now we're talking about another homegrown coordinator. I just don't know if this Eagles offense is going to be the same Eagles offense we saw last year. But the total in this game is 46.5 points with Philly as 1.5 point favorites. Both these teams were good against the run last year. The biggest weakness was Kansas City against tight ends in the slot. Goddard has already been ruled out, so you can rule out the tight end aspect of that. This is going to be potentially a Devontae Smith situation. Devontae Smith ended up with only 3 targets last week. If Chiefs are going to be able to keep this game competitive, then Devontae Smith is going to be in play for us, and he's at 5,600. Let's get an idea what AJ Brown has done against the Chiefs. We're talking on the Chiefs side, we're talking about Travis Kelce is washed, and then we got the Hollywood Brown. Let's see, Hollywood Brown and a handful of like journeymen. All right. So if we're looking at AJ Brown versus the Chiefs in the past, one reception for 8 yards, eight receptions for 133 yards, and one reception for 17 yards. Let's go to the postseason. Postseason, only three receptions, 43 yards, and a touchdown. So uh, the previous Super Bowl they faced off, he had six receptions for 96 yards and a touchdown. So, he has upside, but, I like Devontae Smith a lot better. And, AJ Brown's pretty cheap at 6,600, but Devontae Smith is who I would lean there. On the Chiefs side, I just don't, Hollywood Brown's going to be high owned. He's going to get a ton of usage. I would tend to go with Thornton. Thornton looked pretty good in his opportunities. Like him and Mahomes was trying to throw to him like a few times in this game deep. So like Tyquan Thornton against this Eagles secondary that's got a lot of moving pieces right now. Like they lost a lot of their secondary, so they're vulnerable. So Hollywood Brown is going to be in play, but like Tyquan Thornton is I think who's more interesting, especially at 3,600. So let's go ahead and start, building our lineups. Reminder to hit that like button, give me the 50 likes so I can put my favorite plays in the comment section. And also make sure to subscribe to the channel. I need 50 more to get to, actually about 30 more to get to, uh, 1,800. I'm trying to get to 2,000 ultimately, but let's get to 1,800 first. So hit that subscribe, help me get there. I'm going to have the secret weapon coming out pretty soon. I talked about it in the past. Introducing a website, and I'm going to give free beta access to my YouTube subscribers. So you want to access that. It's going to be a big tool help me out with figuring out a lot of these player news and nuggets. All right, so if we're stacking, let's go with a Jacksonville Cincy stack to start it off with, and try something like that. I'm going to go with Trevor Lawrence because he's cheaper. For wide receivers, let's get Jamar Chase in there. Let's say it's a competitive game, and let's get Thomas and Hunter in there. That's used up a lot of our salaries, so let's go cheap on our running backs. Based off what we've talked about, damn, like ETN is really cheap for the usage he got. Scrolling down a little bit more, I'm going to see if I can find any potential values here before I commit to my first running back. All right, so I'm not really seeing too much value there. Let's go to defense. Browns versus Baltimore, Panthers versus Arizona. At the end of the day, Kyler Murray still sucks. So they're playing at home though. That's the only thing. Chicago, Detroit, New Orleans versus San Francisco. Now, I didn't go into this game. I don't know why I skipped this game. How did I miss this game? New Orleans, San Francisco. Where is this game? That's weird. I wonder why it's not even on my. It's not even on my list here up top. So I don't know how I missed it. But with quick breakdown on New Orleans versus San Francisco, like Mac Jones is a guy that there was a lot of talk on how Shanahan really liked him when he was getting drafted, and they were considering trading up to get Mac Jones, and didn't end up doing it. The Patriots ended up with him, and he just terrible system over with the Patriots, and then got traded to Jacksonville, had some decent games with Jacksonville last year. He was at least able to put the weapons to use, and now he finds his way with Kyle Shanahan. And Shanahan in general is just, we've seen him bring out the best in a lot of these scrubby quarterbacks, like guys like Beat Hard and guys like that ended up being like DFS viable under Shanahan in the past. So, I think that, this is a potential situation for us to exploit, especially with that condensed offense. If we're looking at, let's see. Let's look at the injuries to the 49ers. All right, we're looking at George Kittle is on IR. Brock Purdy is out. Juwan Jennings is questionable. Demarcus Robinson is suspended. We're missing Ayuk, Trent Taylor. They're just decimated. Trent Williams is even questionable. We're looking at Ricky Pearsall and Christian McCaffrey is basically the only weapons. We got Marquez Valdez-Scantling. We saw some upside out of Scantling, when he played last year with the Saints. Kendrick Bourne has rejoined the team as well. Kendrick Bourne got his start with San Francisco, and he played with Mac Jones in New England. So don't sleep on this connection between Mac Jones and Kendrick Bourne. and Kendrick Bourne is likely to get a decent amount of work this week. So let's go back over to our DraftKings page. If I'm looking at the Saints versus 49ers, both teams were weak against the running back last year. That's going to put Kamara in play as our run back. Slot receivers got the most use against New Orleans last year. So I think that would have been Juwan Jennings, but maybe Bourne. Maybe we're going to see Bourne running out of the slot this week. Let me see if we can find out real quick who that slot receiver is going to be. Let's see. Let's see. Pierce only took 8 snaps out of the slot. Jennings took 6. So who are we looking at for the slot receiver on San Francisco? I guess it's going to be Kendrick Bourne. So that's something for us to keep in mind. And Christian McCaffrey obviously would probably be filling a lot of that role. But that's my breakdown of that game. Johnson, the tight end for New Orleans, had a lot of like slot work is on the Saints side. So let's take a look at running backs here. Actually, defense we were on. I don't hate the Eagles' defense versus Kansas City, honestly. If they weren't playing at Kansas City, I would consider that. Let's go with the Cowboys' defense at 3K. That leaves us a little bit better at the running back position. Let's get Gibbs in there. Let's find a cheap tight end. We could put Strange in there instead of like Hunter. But let's save that and go with someone else. Let's put maybe Fannin in there, unless I find somebody more interesting for cheaper. Yeah, let's go Fannin. He got a decent amount of work last week. So let's go with him. Sanders, Jatavian Sanders, I don't mind either, by the way. Let's go back to running back here and see what we can get in that mid-range. ETN is the guy that stands out the most, but we're already pretty stacked at unless we want to do an onslaught of Jacksonville versus Cincy, which is definitely viable. Let's go ahead and let's just put in ETN for now. He's just like such a good value. It's hard to get away from. Let me see what his ownership is. I'm guessing that his ownership is going to be through the roof. No, he's only at about 12%. So he's not horrible. I don't mind doing the onslaught here against this defense, and just hope that the new head coach Liam Cohen is able to live up to his expectations this week. Hollywood Brown gives us an option to put Hollywood Brown in that flex position. We got other options like Diggs, Ridley, Calvin Austin, guys like that. So yeah, I mean, Jacksonville onslaught is not completely out of the question. We know that this game is going to be high scoring, or at least like that's what we would anticipate. If I wanted to go super cheap, let's put in Odunze to be a run back for Gibbs, and let's take out Fannin and go a little bit more expensive on our tight end. See what it gets us. We could get one of these Cincy tight ends in there. I don't want to do that though. If we take the Cowboys D out, let's say we could go with the Saints D, even though I think that the 49ers are going to do well against them. I mean, just to see what that leaves us with tight end options. I mean, that puts us like strange if you wanted to completely go nuts with that game. I don't think that he's going to have that, Trevor Lawrence is going to be able to support that type of output. What is T. Higgins' price? 6,100. What is Brown? Chase Brown is 6,800. So we can't put those guys in there. But yeah, so I mean that's one direction that we can go. Let's try something different. Let's try one of these sneakier type of stacks. Let's go with Mac Jones. And let's put him in with, they're playing at New Orleans, so they're playing in a dome on top of it. So Pearsall, I think, is the easy guy to plug in with them. And let's put McCaffrey in there too. So we're basically getting the entire offense here of San Francisco that has always has a potential to put up points. Let's run it back with Kamara, who's pretty cheap this week. So we got that game stacked. And let's think of who else we like. I like I like using ETN just because all that usage he was getting. I think we got to take advantage of him while we can in these good matchups while he's still affordable. If we're doing ETN, let's get Chase in there too. So if we're looking at 4,400 per guy, let's see what we can get for our. Let's put those Cowboys back in there. Let's look at tight end. Let's go with Warren or someone else. Let's see who else we got. Let's stick with Strange. Strange has a good matchup, and that gets us like 2 Jacksonville guys against Chase. Leaves us with 6,700 for our last receiver. You know what? I liked Devontae Smith. Where's Devontae Smith at? Devontae Smith's at so if we wanted to take out Strange and go with someone, we could go with Warren as our tight end in this build. We got the San Francisco to New Orleans, and then we got Jacksonville, Cincy stack. We got the Dallas defense and the tight end in Warren as our outliers. So pretty good there. Like, got pretty good options if we go cheap at the quarterback position with Mac Jones. Let's say we want to do like a Cleveland Baltimore stack, knowing that these teams have the ability to put up 80 points when they face off against each other. So let's get Flacco. If I'm going with Flacco, let's give him a cheap tight end to stack with. I don't like Flacco and Njoku had like this friendship. I thought that those guys were going to connect, be the big connection last week, but that was not the case. And then I want to get Tillman in there too at 4,300. You could put Judy in there, swap Judy in there too. If we're running it back with Henry, and let's leave it at that for now with that game, because there's other games that I like to stack. Jacksonville, Cincy, I think is going to be the big one. I want to get Chase in there, and I want to get ETN with all the usage he was getting. Let's shoot over to defense. The Cowboys was the best cheap one that I saw. Let's get them back in there. I wouldn't chase Safe Flowers. Just based off of his history, he never comes through. Let's get Nakua in there, and let's check on Devontae Smith. Let's get Smith in there. Let's get Nakua out. So we're looking at like 7K. If we wanted to get a Jacksonville receiver in there, we could put Thomas Jr. And then we got all sorts of other options here. We basically have everybody except for Neighbors, Nakua, and Lamb. But the guy to getting the most usage, Pearsall. You could put like Pearsall in there. Take advantage of his situation, and then we could. We could go up on our tight end, I guess. We can get to Laporta, Tyler Warren again, in Joku if we wanted to go that route. That's one way to do it. If we have Pearsall, we could go with Johnson, Juwan Johnson, in our tight end and swap out, swap one of these guys out. Like if we wanted to swap out Tillman for Judy, we could do that. Something along those lines. We could upgrade the defense if we didn't want to do that. So a lot of options there too. I'm just seeing like a lot of good potential with guys that are probably going to be ignored. People probably aren't thinking that deep about a lot of this. If they're looking too hard at week one's numbers and not realizing that, a lot of these guys were ignored in week one or whatever, or underplayed in week one, then, like they're the recency bias, basically. The recency bias could be affecting people's decision making in week two. And week two is usually a pretty good week if you recognize that, like, a lot of these guys don't play in preseason anymore. They're coming out slow and probably didn't have great week ones, but they're going to be in play in week two for sure. So you see how the ownership spreads out, and make sure not to go too chalky in week two, and make sure to take advantage of some of the recency bias, and then some of the cheap quarterbacks who have decent matchups this week. Hit the like button, give me to 50 likes. Hit the subscribe button, help me get to 1,800, and I will see you guys a little bit later on with a Sunday night showdown show. You're going to want to subscribe, just for that, because those showdown shows have been hitting the captain quite a few times already this season. Haven't had the whole package come together yet, but the captain options are giving you guys at least, like low owned captain options to use when you build your own lineups.